There were like 125 people that had been defrauded in this whole case. And Dave got sentenced to prison, federal prison, for 5 years and 11 months. So Madison, Wisconsin is not the kind of place where you think you're going to find a cool car dealership. Wisconsin in general is not where you think you're going to find any of this stuff, right? But Madison is a little unique around town, around the state. We always call Madison 20 square miles surrounded by reality. And by reality, we mean the rest of Wisconsin. So it is definitely a unique place. And growing up, there was a dealership on the southwest side of town called Capital Corvette. And I remember being a kid and going in there, and this was just the coolest place because of all the places in the world, we had this Corvette dealer right in town. It was owned by a guy called Dave Larson. And Dave, this is back in like the late 80s, early 90s. Dave was known and respected throughout the Corvette community pretty much around the country, which was a big deal before social media and everything because you couldn't just look somebody up on the internet. Dave had built this business. He had cars for sale. He probably had about 20 cars or so in the showroom, give or take. Mostly Corvettes. He had some other stuff, some muscle cars, some old classic Chevys and Fords and whatnot, but mostly Corvettes was what he was known for. He had also had a full service shop in the back, worked on all these cars. We, as a family, we had some work done on some of our cars there, and he had storage in there as well. So the storage was really cool. It was like 3-high storage, but it wasn't storage like what Matt Farah has at his place today, where it's all on lifts. It was almost like racking, and the cars were on their sideways. It was very interesting how he did that. So I remember growing up as a kid, going into this place several times with my parents. And I do remember talking to Dave Larson several years later and some other folks and him saying, you and your family, you were the only kids that were allowed to walk around that showroom unsupervised. He said, because you guys would come in, you take off your coats at the door and leave them right there. And you always walked up next to the cars with your hands behind your back. He's like, I knew that you respected the cars. So that was always cool to hear. But Dave was the kind of guy, like he went to a car show, everybody knew Dave. I remember growing up, my parents had a 1978 Silver Anniversary Corvette. My dad had bought his first Corvette after he passed the CPA exam because that's what you do to celebrate being an accountant. But he had gotten later a 78 Silver Anniversary, and that was the car he had when I was born. And I remember getting some work done there. It was serviced there a couple times, stored there a couple times. And my dad actually traded it in at Capital Corvette for an 86 convertible at one point, 86 pace car convertible. And I remember my little sister crying so hard when that happened that Larson thought the deal was going to fall through. And it didn't. My dad assured him it was going to be fine. And my sister was very happy with the convertible. As a lot of car people go, or as a lot of people go in general, when you're passionate about something and you try to make it a business, sometimes you're not a great business person. And that's unfortunate. And I think that's kind of what started to happen here. Dave would bring in cars for his showroom himself, but a lot of the cars he brought in were on consignment. Being in Wisconsin in the 80s, everybody just trusts everybody. Like, that's just how we are, right? I mean, nobody even locked their front doors back then. And people had no qualms about bringing the car in, dropping it off at Dave, putting it on consignment, and leaving the title. And some people even would go through the hassle of saying, I don't want to come down here when it's sold, I'm busy. And they would sign an open title and leave it with Dave. I don't know exactly how it happened. Sometimes it's money issues, sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's women. I don't think it was a lot of that stuff. I think it was just a combination of him skimming a little too much off the top, coming into some financial troubles. But what Dave started doing was he would sell the cars, but not pay the consignor. So somebody would call up to say, hey, sell my car yet? He'd go, well, no, not yet. I've got it in for some service, or I'm sending it to a show, hopefully soon. But in the meantime, he'd actually sold the car and pocketed the money. It was kind of like a Ponzi scheme in that eventually he'd sell another car, he'd pay the first guy. But this kept going for several years. And as a lot of these things do, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And Dave was starting to have some issues with money. And so the next thing he did was he started to reach out to investors. And he said, hey, I'd like to kind of grow and expand the business. I want to go buy some new inventory. Could you loan me some money? And it was interesting, he would never go to a bank for a loan because a bank would want you to secure it somehow. And they'd put liens on titles and whatnot. And Dave was smart. He would go to these investors and say, I will secure all your loans because I'll give you the titles to these cars. And you'll hold the title. And then when I sell the car, I'll either give you a title to a different car or I'll pay you back your money. Then what Dave would do is he would go back to the consignor and say, hey, I had some paperwork issues. I lost the title to your car. Could you go to the DMV and get a duplicate? And the consignor would, yep, no problem. I can go do that for you. And they would get him another title. And it got to the point where some of these cars had several titles. The investors, several investors, would each have titles to the car. And then eventually Dave would, of course, sell the car, and the new owner would have a title for the car. And that's what they registered it with. And it even got to the point, and I'm not sure exactly how this happened, but a couple of the vehicles that were in for storage, he had the titles for. And he was able to do this with some of them. And people would come and pick up their cars from storage, and he'd say, hey, I don't have your car. We had an issue, there was some damage, I will write you a check for the car. But it was another way that he was able to kind of move some money around. Well, as these things go, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and kind of by the mid-90s, this was too much for him to handle. And I remember it was the summer of like 1996 or somewhere in there, the city police for Fitchburg on the south side of Madison and the county sheriffs, they're all showing up to execute a search warrant, and they start going through the dealership, and they start figuring all this out. And of course, Larson gets brought in on charges, the county's got charges against him, and the state's got charges against him. And then the feds come in. And when it all shook out, the feds had about 20 some charges. I think it was 21 charges against Dave, mostly for wire fraud and mail fraud. Because really that's how they get these guys, right? They say, well, he did some of these deals through the mail or on the phone, interstate. And that's one of the easiest ways for them to finally catch you and bring you in. So as it shakes out, Dave pleads guilty to 7 of them, and they drop the other 14. And the state even dropped all their charges to allow the feds to come in and work on this. The courts kind of do some back-end calculations to say, well, there's all these titles everywhere. Some of these loans he paid parts of, and then he took out more loans, and they did all these calculations to figure out what he owed. And they've actually done like legal studies on how they did these calculations, but it came out to about $3.5 million that he owed. They said about $1 million of it was from the actual cars themselves, and then there was actually like $3.5 to $4 million to investors, but he'd paid some of that back. So it came out to about $3.5 million total. There were like 125 people that had been defrauded in this whole case. And Dave got sentenced to prison, federal prison, for 5 years and 11 months, which was the maximum that you could get sentenced for that. They had like these weird tiers in the system where if it's between like $2 and $5 million, it was 5 years and 11 months, and anything $5 million and more was 6 years or something like that. So that was the max that they could sentence him. And the judge knew that we have to do something on this restitution, right? You got $3.5 million out there, but this guy's going to jail. He's obviously going through personal bankruptcy. And so they had him set up to pay back at like $97 a month. And if you do the math, that comes out to like 36,000 months or 3,000 years. So you're pretty sure most of these people are going to get screwed. Now, the way it worked, the court then had to figure out, who do these cars belong to? Because there's titles everywhere. And unfortunately, the way it ended up was anybody who actually bought the car had bought it on good faith. They had a title. It was registered to them. Most of them have some proof of payment. They generally got to keep the cars. Then the people who had originally consigned the cars with Dave, they had to go to their insurance companies and file a theft case and try to get some money back. And some did and some didn't. But the investors were the ones who really got mostly screwed. And they were the ones who ended up getting the $97 a month split amongst them. I think the saddest part was this dealership was really well known, really well respected while it was open. And like I said, everyone in Wisconsin just trusts everybody, right? And it was blowing up in the local paper for months afterwards. And people would write in and they'd say, you know, this is terrible, this guy's awful. And there are other people who'd write in and say, oh, it was all these rich people in their cars. But when you look at what happened at the sentencing hearings, it was a lot of people who said, hey, I inherited this car, or I worked my entire life at the plant and saved up and I bought this car and I know nothing about these cars, so I trusted Dave to take care of it. And so despite what a lot of people thought at the time, it was a lot of blue collar people that really got screwed out of their vehicles in the end, which was terrible. And the site itself for that dealership sat empty for over 10 years just because of the bad stigma of the spot. And actually later on, another dealer opened up there for a little bit, another classics and resto shop. And they actually are the shop that claimed to have the only Tucker convertible to ever exist. But they were only there for a few years and they had to close up too. Eventually, this shop the whole building had to get torn down. And they claimed it was because they were redoing the roads, but really they just couldn't get anybody in there. People just despised everything that had to do with Capital Corvette at the time. The biggest thing that the community learned was, obviously, you can't trust everybody, even in Wisconsin, which was terrible. But I think Ed's the one who always says, in a car deal, there's the money, there's the title, there's the car, and nobody gets all three. And this is a classic example of how a bunch of people in Wisconsin learned that one the hard way.
We have extended our promotion with Celebrity Machines, so if you use the code VINwiki, you'll still get a discount on the replica license plates from your favorite star cars from your favorite movies and television shows. But if you go over to VINwiki.com, you're going to see a lot of license plates, like this replica of the plate from my Diablo from Japan, autographed Car Trek plates, and all of those came from Celebrity Machines as well. So if you're looking to have a promotional plate to pass out to fans, to use on some cars, or to do anything to promote your business, Celebrity Machines can handle that. Any state, any characters, any country even, they can make it happen. So check them out now at the link in the description below. Use the code VINwiki for a discount and thank them for their support of the channel.